Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr, and this is episode 173, and it's Windows and Walls Part 2. And we've got, this is the second part of that story that I wrote a few years ago when I first started writing on a regular basis, and I have a few things to say about it, actually, now, but let's go ahead and finish the story first. He was just finishing lunch. Her voice filled the room, soft and warm, and he smiled as he answered, but with surprise. "Rebecca, this is your decision day. I thought you wouldn't be calling," he said. "I'm told that I can wait until evening, 6 p.m., but I could have done it early this morning," she said. "So why did you put it off?" Gregory asked. "Because I hadn't made my decision yet," she replied. She paused, and Gregory looked down at the cup of coffee in his hands. It, of course, had been colored according to her description, but he'd also added some sugar because he thought of her as sweet, and it didn't affect the color of the coffee. "Why not?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Because I wasn't sure," she said, "but now I am. I hope to meet you, outside, but just in case I don't, I wanted to talk to you one more time." People who had made their decision to go to the outside were not allowed to talk to those who had not yet decided, or to those who had decided to remain inside. She paused, but Gregory didn't know what to say. She resumed. "If you decide to remain inside, that's okay," she said. "I thought about that too. I'm not only going outside to meet you. I want to see the world, what it's like to walk around, what it's like to see people, have them see me, touch each other. It feels right for me. I hope it feels right for you too, and if you do decide to come outside, don't make it just because of me." I wouldn't," Gregory said, hesitating. "Good. Don't. Do it for your own reasons, because you want to see the world. I've enjoyed talking with you, learning about you, but I think we both know that it may or may not work for us on the outside, and it doesn't have to. There are a lot of people out there. If we don't work out, there's a world of possibility, okay?" "Okay," Gregory said. "I hope to see you outside," Rebecca said, "but if not, I won't be upset." "If I don't see you," she said, "it was nice knowing you." Before Gregory could think of what to say, she had disconnected. He was at first inclined to be angry at himself for not saying something honest, something clever, anything at all. Then he realized he couldn't be angry, because he wasn't sure what he should have said. Even after giving it a good long thought, he didn't know what he should have said to her. He watched the clock. She might have made her decision and been forever outside right after their call. Or perhaps that had been her plan, to talk to him, let her know she was outside, and then immediately go. But what if it wasn't? What if, despite her words, she still had doubts, had held on until the 6 p.m. deadline? What if, he wondered, as the clock slunk toward that hour, she decided, in the end, to stay inside? Everyone had fears about going outside, or so he understood. What if she changed her mind? She wouldn't be able to contact him after her decision. What if he went outside in 2 days and she wasn't there? Would it be worth it to leave the comfort and safety of computer and the inside? Or without Rebecca, would it just be a wretched world, gray and lonely? He watched the clock as it rolled past 6 p.m. and knew that, one way or the other, Rebecca had made her decision. And now, more than ever, he would be forced to think about his. He hardly slept that night. His mind was turning round and would not let him rest. He thought of going to the orgasm room, or just taking care of it himself. He'd successfully done that before, but it just didn't interest him. The unknowns were too great. If he stayed inside, he would, in the future, be able to contact others who stayed inside. He could even see them visually, not just hear their voices. If Rebecca stayed inside, he would be able to see her. But he didn't think it likely. He felt it more likely that she had, in fact, followed what she had laid out and chosen the outside. That meant if he stayed inside, he would never be able to see her again. If he chose outside, then he could see her, and could also be with her, touch her even, if she too chose outside. She would never see her again if he was outside and she chose to stay inside. Because of that, he decided he must figure out whether he really wanted to be outside beyond anything to do with Rebecca. Inside, he was safe, secure, and stimulated. And he would be all his life. Outside, things were not so sure. There were diseases, there were problems, there were difficulties. He thought of them as having a capital D. Death, disease, decay. But outside is where people were, and beyond Rebecca, Gregory found himself wondering about other people. What it would be like to talk with them, not just one-on-one and not just by voice, but right in front of other people, and possibly in groups. What would he like to smell the dirt, the grass, the trees? He'd learned that all of these had distinct smells. Would any of them smell like his coffee, his food, his armpits after exercise, his shit? Or would they be new smells? How many smells were there? What would Rebecca smell like? And a part of him, a tiny part of him, was wondering if all of it was a lie. Perhaps inside was the only good place. Perhaps all the scenes he had seen on all the screens, all the amazing places and wonderful vistas were made up. Perhaps outside was just a wasteland or a desert. Or, contrarily, perhaps this was all a test. Perhaps those who chose to be outside and are allowed to live to meet with other people. Perhaps they put their resources into the inside just for the young people. If they grow up and don't want to join society, then what? Perhaps they're killed. Perhaps there was a reason he had never talked directly to someone over 18, someone who had chosen inside. Perhaps it was not simply against the rules. Perhaps they were all dead. It struck him how naive he was. He really had no way of telling what the outside world would be like. How could he have taken so long to think of these options? He wondered if that would be the worst, if he chose outside and Rebecca chose inside and was killed. Would he even know? Would he be allowed to know? He'd always been told that those who had chosen inside could only ever communicate with others who had chosen inside. But could those who chose outside learn the fates of their insider friends? Then another even worse thought came to him. Worse than if he ended up living in an outside wasteland with or without Rebecca. What if outside was exactly as it had been presented, and he just wasn't ready for it? What if he chose something that would lead immediately to him failing, falling, perhaps dying? What then? Was in fact anything that happened inside truly preparing him for what was to come outside? And if not, why was this done? Why keep the children away from everyone else? What purpose could it hold? In the end, he told himself what his decision would be, and that was just enough for him to get a little sleep. That morning he was awakened a little later than usual by Computer. "I could tell you didn't sleep well," Computer said. "You can make the decision any time you like." Gregory nodded his head but did not reply. He ate breakfast in a fog, not really tasting it. "Is there anything I can do to make you more comfortable?" Computer asked. Gregory just shook his head no. It was nearly noon before he'd even come close to giving an answer. He knew from being told long ago that he only had to inform Computer of his decision, and that would be that. But though he had to make a decision that night, he found it hard to commit to today. But though he had made a decision last night, he found it hard to commit to today. I'm going to redo that one too. But though he had made his decision last night, he found it hard to commit to today. He thought of his options. Was it better to choose what he knew, even if it meant not really experiencing the world? Or would it be better to take a chance? He was walking around aimlessly and ended up in the orgasm room. He looked at the pillow. It was clean and soft, just as it always was. "Not enough," Gregory said. "Clean and soft isn't enough." He lifted his voice. "Computer," he said, "my decision is to go outside." Very well, Gregory, Computer said. I have enjoyed serving you. Please walk down the hall to your right. Gregory walked, and there was a door on the left side at the end of the hall. It had never been there before. The interior walls changed, but the exterior ones did not. Now there was a door there. It must have been there the whole time, he thought. I wonder how I never saw it before, or any hint of it. The door slid open when he approached. It was early afternoon outside, and the weather seemed to be fine. He didn't detect any special heat or cold as he approached. The light seemed very bright to him, and he squinted a bit. The door opened, not directly outside, but to a hall. Gregory imagined that some of Computer's tools must be on the other side of the walls. He had been living in a box inside a box. The light fell at an angle inside the hallway. He stopped just before his feet reached the rays. He bent down and slowly put his hand out into the sunlight. This is the first real sunlight I've ever felt, or seen, he thought. It was warm. It surprised him. Light wasn't warm in his experience. It felt good, though. He remembered Computer had said that sunlight, though healthy in small doses, should be not stayed in indefinitely. He assumed this meant he had some time. He stood back up and took his first step into the sunlight. A few steps more and he was at the end of the hallway. One more step and he would be outside forever. He could have looked back. Part of him wanted to look back. But there wasn't anything for him back there. So he just stepped outside. He stepped onto a small concrete slab. In front of him was a lawn. Looking around, he saw that his computer, was one building along a line of similar buildings that made up a rough square. There were a few gaps that led someplace he didn't know. There were perhaps a dozen buildings on each side. The square was quite large. Perhaps, he thought, looking at the clear sky and the buildings around him, we are brought outside here so that for the moment we can still experience having walls around us, so we don't panic at the sheer size of outside. And as though he had a blind spot that hadn't allowed him to see it before, he now saw that there were two people, roughly in the middle of the lawn. A lawn that smelled unlike anything he'd ever smelled before, and part of him relished it. But his attention was focused on the people. One was a man, tall and thin, wearing what Gregory understood was a formal suit. He held a tablet in his hand. The other was a woman, dark-skinned, with long, wavy black hair. Rebecca? He hadn't even known that he said it aloud, but in the quiet, enclosed, if large, space it had carried. "Gregory," Rebecca said. "Yes, it's me." Gregory started forward, but the world seemed to upend around him. He felt dizzy. Just knowing that he was looking directly at another human being, two of them, really, and one of them, Rebecca, was enough to cause him a slight vertigo. The man held Rebecca back with a touch on her arm and said something Gregory couldn't hear. They advanced on Gregory, but at an unhurried pace. Gregory started forward. The first few steps were as awkward as a newborn fawn's, so even though every instinct was shouting at him to run forward, he pulled himself upright and took a medium pace. They stopped only a meter or so from each other. The man had held up a hand, and by silent agreement, everyone had stopped. "Gregory," the man said, and Gregory took a good look at him for the first time. His hair was pulled straight back over his head and seemed plastered to it. He had dark eyes, slightly sunken, and a medium complexion, roughly halfway between his and Rebecca's. "Gregory," the man repeated. Seeing that Gregory had been distracted, "we're all very happy that you chose to come outside with us. In order to keep the transition from being overwhelming, we like to meet new outsiders with no more than 3 greeters. As Rebecca requested to be your greeter, I came along simply to be a more experienced hand, so a more experienced hand could be here. At first. I'll shortly leave you two alone to talk. But first, how are you feeling?" "I'm fine," Gregory said. His head had mostly cleared, though the end of the adrenaline rush was still affecting him. "Any initial questions about being outside?" the man asked. "Mostly questions for Rebecca," Gregory said. The man smiled. "Very well," he said. "I'll leave you two alone." Back in a while, or give a shout if you want me." He gave a small nod, turned, and walked away. Gregory now looked at Rebecca, who looked back. They were each drinking in all about the details about each other. Gregory saw her pointed nose, her wide jawline, and her large, expressive, almost black eyes. She looked at him, and he imagined her looking at his pale face, his occasional freckles, and his mousy hair. Though he was nervous, he saw that she was smiling. "It's great to see you," Rebecca said. She held out her hands, palms down. Gregory's breath hitched a little, and he held out his hands, taking hers in his own. It was the strangest feeling he had ever experienced. Her hands were warm, not cold like plastic, but soft. He could tell that she felt his hands in hers as well, but while he could feel her hands, it was unlike touching his own skin. His mind was doing turns, trying to understand how skin could be felt but not feel. And he decided that he liked it. And that's the end of the story. As I said in the last episode, I wrote this a few years ago when I just first started writing again. And it's kind of interesting because, obviously I was going for themes about, isolation, themes about childhood, themes about, how we learn about the world, stuff like that. And I think those still apply, but it's kind of funny to be reading this out in a time when there's a pandemic and everyone's sort of artificially separated and in their own homes anyway. So I hope you enjoyed it. Actually, I thought this was a very interesting story for me to revisit, like I say, especially at this period in history. And thank you for listening. If you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, CryptoBiography@gmail.com, or hit me up on Facebook or Twitter. And thanks for listening. Words and music copyright 2020, CryptoBiography LLC, all rights reserved. Characters and events are fictional, fictionalized, or satirical.